Okay, now we're gonna go. All right. Do we have people that we've let in yet?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Everybody ready to go? Glass of water, take a deep breath. Real centered. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Loop and Learn T1D speaker series, a special event today with Dr. Rayhan Lal from Stanford University School of Medicine. He's a pediatric and adult endo. He is a type 1. His sisters are type 1s. He is a looper or has been a looper. And he's going to talk today about a very, very important topic, which is the limits and the cautions that we all need to know about AIDs or closed loop systems. Just a quick reminder, if you have your mic open, please mute that and so that we don't get a lot of crosstalk. And as we always do, we put out a little disclaimer. And this presentation is provided to assist you in making your own decisions and share essential information regarding using closed loop systems safely. Please consult with your healthcare professionals regarding your own diabetes self-management. And if you are using a DIY loop app, take full responsibility for building and running the system and do so at your own risk. So I'm going to take this off of share and I'm going to tell you a little bit about Rayhan. And Dr. Rayhan Lal has spoken with us in the past, and it's always something where we learn, and it's been outstanding. He is an incredible doctor. He's not my doctor yet. Pediatric adult, he's a researcher, and as I mentioned, he has T1D. He is affiliated with Stanford University Healthcare and Lucile Packard Children's Hospital, Stanford. And I just pulled a quote in case you didn't read that in the notice from Rayhan, that he grew up in the East Bay area of Northern California and has had type 1 diabetes for 30 plus years. I'm sure it's 31 or 32 plus years by now. He studied electrical engineering, computer science at UC Berkeley with the hope of applying his knowledge to diabetes technology. The significance of clinical practice became clear to him after his siblings also developed diabetes, type 1 diabetes. And direct quote, "I am devoting my life to advancing the care of diabetes in people of all ages." This is really quite an honor today. So thank you, Rayhan. I'm going to turn this over to you and welcome and take us away.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Joanne. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay. Well, it is such a pleasure to be with the Loop and Learn team again. So appreciate everyone joining us today. I did want to preface this by saying I'm going to be talking about all automated insulin dosing today. I work in the commercial space. I work in the open source space. To me, these are all tools that can help us better manage our diabetes. So I think a lot of the challenges are crosstalk between the different systems. So there are very similar challenges that we see. Some systems are overcoming some of them, some are still working on them, but it's an ever-evolving field. Here are my disclosures. And just to expound on my background a little bit, I had type 1 for more than 30 years now. Growing up, I never really wanted to do anything diabetes related. I was very interested in just living my life and doing the things that I loved. And I was a huge nerd, so I wanted to become an electrical engineer and computer scientist. So I went to UC Berkeley and did that. And then worked in the field for a little while before my two younger sisters eventually developed type 1 as well. When that happened, I decided I needed to shift gears, move into medicine so I could help all my brothers and sisters out there living with diabetes. I went to UC Davis for medical school, and it was coming to the end of that. I was like, you know, I don't know if I can choose between taking care of kids and adults with diabetes. I didn't have the greatest transition experience from pediatric to adult endocrinology, as many of you probably are familiar with. This is a really challenging time in someone's life. So I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could do both? And so I went to LA County Hospital and did residency in adult medicine and pediatrics. There I saw a very underserved portion of the population. As many of you know, in this country, we treat the undocumented as criminals, and we do not provide them the access some of us on the presentation may take for granted. So that has stuck with me. Eventually, I went to Stanford because it was a center for diabetes technology research. My mentor, Dr. Bruce Buckingham, has worked on many commercial closed-loop devices and the technology that led up to that. So it was a potential place where I could really dig my heels and connect my engineering world with my clinical world. And so I've been here for the last 7-8 years, working as a physician scientist. I finished my fellowship a couple years back, and I've been on faculty here. Spend the majority of my time doing diabetes technology research, and then running our guided transfer program, where I help foster that transition from the pediatric to adult world. Okay, so let's start at the beginning here. And when I say beginning, I really mean beginning. So many people like to show this image of Arnie Kadish as an almost joke, like, oh yeah, look at how big that first pump was. This is a backpack-sized device. But what a lot of people miss is that this is a bihormonal intravenous automated insulin dosing system. So Arnie had a continuous glucose monitor built into this thing, feeding in from blood from the vein, and then also intravenous delivery of insulin and glucagon. So in many respects, we have not surmounted this technology, which he published about in 1964. If we're really lucky, the bihormonal bionic pancreas trial will begin in 2023, only 59 years after Arnie set up this system. And this was all work he did over at Loma Linda. Okay. And I don't have to tell this group, but automated insulin dosing of late has been due to rapid changes in diabetes technology, particularly sensors, which have allowed for closed-loop control of insulin delivery. And the FDA gives interoperable designations to each of the components of such a system. The first was granted to Dexcom for the iCGM. Any medical device run through the FDA has to meet the so-called general controls, which are just general regulations that most devices have to meet. There are a few exceptions. And then these special controls are defined for these specific devices. So the iCGM's special controls were based upon Dexcom's performance characteristics. They weren't necessarily derived for the purposes of, hey, these are what need to be maintained in order to have an effective closed-loop system. They just turned out to be the specifications of the particular precedent device, which was the Dexcom G6. Next came the alternate controller enabled and key point enabled but not required pump, which means that this device could in principle work with other technologies, but that still has not become the default for defining alternate controller enabled pumps. And then finally, the classification for the algorithm, the IAGC, or interoperable automated glycemic controller. Now, the important thing to realize here is that you can create an iCGM and not worry about an ACE pump partner or an IAGC. You can create an ACE pump without necessarily worrying about an iCGM or an IAGC. But thus far, the IAGC has had to be approved paired with a CGM and a pump. So as you can see, these interoperability designations do have their limits, and in fact, in some ways have been used to curtail progress, unfortunately. But in theory, if you connect these three components together, you can have closed loop insulin delivery. In other words, a signal comes in from the CGM, gets processed by your microprocessor, sends a signal to a pump, the pump delivers insulin, which creates a change in blood sugar, which is then read by the CGM, and you close the loop. So sometimes this is called closed loop control. I like to refer to this as automated insulin dosing. Okay, so I know the purpose of our talk today is supposed to be sort of like, well, there are some situations where AID might be challenging, may present dilemmas, but I do want to preface this by saying every US pump manufacturer now has an AID system available. So whether or not you're going for it, it is being offered. In 2020, Pease and colleagues out of Australia performed a network meta-analysis. This is a sort of powerful analytic technique to look at a bunch of old studies. And what they did was they looked at all available combinations of technologies that have been studied. So they looked at injections combined with finger sticks. They looked at injections combined with CGM. They looked at CGM combined with pump. They looked at all possible combinations that had been studied. And they definitively found that systems where you had an integrated pump and CGM resulted in the most significant improvements in time in range, A1C, and severe hypoglycemia. So for most people with type 1 diabetes, the AID benefits outweigh the risks. I will say that, of course, everything is sort of a most people in the research realm, right? And also keep in mind that most technology studies we do on diabetes are on white, socioeconomically privileged, college-educated individuals. So it is always a question whether these findings generalize to everyone. And I think it is important that we acknowledge that, but we do also acknowledge the fact that if you look at the evidence in total, there is a glycemic benefit and likely a quality of life benefit to a lot of these technologies. Okay, so in order to even get into risks and questions of use, we must understand how these systems work, because without that, we really can't explain risks and benefits for a black box, right? So this is where understanding how these systems work does become important. Okay, so we'll start with our old friend, the PID controller, very old control strategy used in industrial processes. I'm going to take the example here for glucose control, but you could use this in industrial temperature control or a great many other processes. So what you have is a set glucose target, and what you have coming in is the CGM glucose. And if you subtract those, you'll get how far away are you from your target as a function of time. And when you have a function, you can do many things to functions. You can add them together, you can subtract them, you can divide them, you can multiply them, you can convolve them. But what we do with a PID controller is we take three operations. We take a proportional term, which is basically we multiply whatever the value of that function is, the difference between target and CGM, and we multiply that by a scalar value. We take the integral, which is the area under the curve. So it's a recording of the history of how far away you are from target. And we take the derivative, which is how fast that rate of change is for the error function. And each of those terms gets scaled by a scalar factor. So for proportionate term, obviously you need a scalar factor, so that's Kp. And then we have an integral scalar factor Ki and Kd. And we add that together in such a way that it reflects an insulin change. That insulin change goes back to the pump, and then the changes are reflected on the CGM. Okay, so that's one form of control, a very CGM-dependent form of control. And next we have fuzzy logic. This basically is abstracting whatever state we are currently in. And this is an example. This isn't actually implemented in any specific system, but this is a case where we fuzzify or abstract the blood sugar level into low, normal, high, very high, or very, very high. And then we also abstract the rate of change of the blood sugar into very negative, negative, zero, positive, or very positive. And the blood glucose acceleration, which is the second derivative of the glucose, we take as negative, zero, positive. And then experts give us an opinion when we're in each of these states, what we should do with the insulin. And usually that's the way fuzzy logic works. It's using experience and a priori knowledge to decide what to do under certain conditions. And the other important thing is now more of these insights are starting to come from machine learning versus gathering a group of experts to come up with these. So we've talked about PID, we've talked about fuzzy logic. This brings us to Medtronic's controller because they tend to use these techniques. But there are questions we need to understand really to be able to talk about risks of Medtronic systems. So you can take a derivative or integral over a period of time, right? If I say an area under a curve, it depends how much time we're talking about. If I take a derivative, it's the change in that function over a change in time. I need to also know what that change in time is. So if you wait longer, you can reduce errors from sort of sudden spontaneous changes, but you also reduce the responsiveness to changes. So we would want to know over what time frame do they perform those operations. The other thing is that those scalar terms are not static. They do get auto-tuned every so often to convert those error function operations into insulin. And so how frequently those get tuned, again, affects the rate of adaptation. And then there's been a big question about when and how much fuzzy logic gets used for the 780G. They did license some from DreamMed, but we've heard a lot of mixed messages about how much actually gets used in the system. And then also, what is the basis for this fuzzy logic? Okay. And next, we'll go to sort of one of the more popular techniques these days, which is predictive control. And Loop sort of gives them the quickest example of a predictive controller. And if you ever get curious, you can tap your glucose graph up here, and it'll show you how it's predicting the future. But effectively, most variants of Loop add the effect of carbs on increasing the blood sugar, plus the effects of insulin on decreasing the blood sugar, and then the two forms of short-term adaptation, the glucose momentum, which adds the prior rates of change into the future prediction, and the retrospective correction, which says, if my model made an error in predicting the future, I'm going to add that error into the next term to hopefully get closer to the actual value. So who else uses predictive control? Well, Tandem uses predictive control, not necessarily model predictive control. It's really more of a Kalman filter to determine the glucose and insulin state at a given point in time, but there is some prediction involved. So we need to know what is the rate of adaptation for that system. We also need to know that the settings you put into the system are not always the ones used for explicit calculations. So when the system is inferring something about your insulin dosing, how is it doing that? Auto boluses are based on the programmed ISF if it is within a certain window of the inferred settings. But basal modulation is more based on those inferred settings and capped by the set basal. So another big question for us is, for most users, the bulk of automated insulin given by basal modulation or auto boluses, does it depend upon the person? Okay, and then the latest kid on the block, Omnipod 5, we want to ask the question, well, again, what is your rate of adaptation? We know that the first pod you use is operating in a less aggressive state, and the algorithm aggressiveness does change abruptly after the first pod. So users should have realistic expectations of how that aggressiveness is going to change. Also know what equations govern their inferred settings. A lot of what they initialize to is based off the total daily basal. And the reason they do that is if you look at the dispersion of total daily basals, it's much less. Obviously, we usually aren't changing our basals on a sort of moment-to-moment setting, but if you look at total daily dose, which Tandem tends to use, there is more dispersion that is incurred there. So what happens for the Omnipod 5 if initialized basal settings are way off? Okay. So you'll notice that I asked all these questions of the commercial systems, and I didn't really ask those questions of the open source systems, and you can understand why, right? Because for open source systems, if we want to know, we open up the code and we look at how it calculates something. And we can run simulators because we have the code available, and we can really understand that. But in the commercial world, this becomes sort of trade secret, intellectual property, whatever you want to call it, such that the provider and the person living with the disease don't know what's under the black box. Okay. So now to the topic at hand, sort of where do things go wrong? What can go wrong? So let's start with the components here. So Jan Crowder in 2021 made this heroic effort to try to put together the data from the manufacturer and user facility device experience database. This is also affectionately dubbed the MAUDE database. Now, basically, anytime somebody complains of a device event to the manufacturer, they are obligated to report that data into the MAUDE database. But unfortunately, that database is really hard to search, especially when you're trying to aggregate all the data together for the purposes of quality improvement. And you would figure that that's exactly what you would want to do with this sort of data. Put it all together and try to analyze what is actually going on. So the company is legally obligated to put this information together, submit it into this database, and also try to recuse themselves from responsibility if appropriate. This does get challenging because there is no oversight after it's put in. There is no summary statistics after it's put in. And here, this paper was an attempt to put all of those events together using a lot of extra searching technology. You cannot, for example, just go to the MAUDE database and say, give me all of the injury events that occurred for pumps in 2018. Would seem like you would want to be able to do such a thing with a database, but unfortunately, it's not built that way. And Joanne asked the questions, does MAUDE have any data on the open source systems? It certainly does, but I will caution everyone that it is important to realize that if you search this database, for example, you ask it, tell me all the control IQ events, you actually won't find any for the algorithm. It will be classified usually as the T-Slim X2, for example. So you actually have to go and dig under the pump to access the algorithm issues. Similarly, it would be exceedingly challenging to then search for the pump systems and then cross-reference it. But all this being said, those all get filed if they are reported and either the physician or the person with diabetes brings it to the attention of the manufacturer or their caregiver. Okay, so these adverse events are recorded, and what we find here is that insulin pump and CGM may be associated with tens of thousands of injury events. I'm not talking about just malfunctions, actual injury, and hundreds of deaths in sort of isolation, at least, is what's reported here. Now, of course, the crosstalk between these systems has become a more important concept with each passing year. So again, one doesn't really know, if somebody had an issue of over delivery in the context of an erroneous CGM value, who takes the heat for that? Is it the CGM or is it the pump? And that does create a question, and it makes it harder to search for. So a big place where we can improve what we do is the storage, access, and delineation of when things go wrong. Okay, so let's talk about the components, because you remember I talked about iCGM, ACE pump, IAGC. So let's talk about each of those. We will start with the Clark error grid. And I do want to mention here, this was developed in the 80s and presented in diabetes care as a way of assessing the accuracy of fingerstick glucometers. So usually what we compare to is a gold reference standard, the venous glucose along the x-axis, and then the comparator is along the vertical axis here. So in the case of CGM, this would be a CGM value. And anything within region A is sort of within 20% of one another, usually not expected to cause any major harm. Region B is greater than 20% deviation, but the error probably won't cause harm in terms of using it to deliver insulin. Region C creates unnecessary behaviors based on erroneous data, which are potentially harmful, although not 100% harmful always. Region D is when low and high values are undetected. So in other words, you would be low or very high, and the system would tell you you are not. So you would take no action when you probably should take action. And region E is when low and high are completely reversed. And obviously, this is really where we start to get worried. This is the greater than 400 when you're actually less than 40. This is the less than 40 when you're actually greater than 400 zones. So these are the ones where we really run into trouble with these systems. And with respect to CGMs, you know most of these, but I will focus on the ones that currently power AID, which are the wire-based sensors. They rely on glucose oxidase enzyme. And for these, eliminating calibrations meant identical hardware manufacturing. So all your sensors have to look very similar. And then you have to have data from those similar looking sensors on a wide enough slew of the population to actually make it so you can give generalizations. Now, we know that we will never get sample data from every single person. So we have to pick and choose. We design a curve of accuracy. And that curve of accuracy, what we try to do is we try to get the most people as accurate as possible. And if you're one of those most people, you're in great shape. But if you are not, if you are sort of the sacrificial lamb to give accuracy to these other folks, then unfortunately, you will have a harder time with sensors in general. So this is an important thing to know about sensor accuracy on an individual basis. Okay. And the other thing to know about these sensors is that they are reading from the interstitial space, which is fundamentally a different space from the blood supply, from the capillary. It is different. It's like saying I'm going to measure glucose from tears or sweat versus measuring it from blood. You are fundamentally measuring in a different place. So let's talk about that for a moment, because that also has impact. This was a study done on pigs where they took the same sensor. In gray, you see them measuring the glucose after an IV glucose tolerance test, and gray was in the interstitial space. Black was in the intraperitoneal space by the guts, and red was in the artery, and blue was in the vein. And you see that in the actual bloodstream, so in the veins and arteries, you see what you would expect, which is a very rapid increase in glucose as I push the glucose into the blood vessel with my IV. So these are behaving closest to what I would consider as the ground truth. Now, the intraperitoneal space is delayed, it's a little attenuated, but you can still tell, hey, there was a peak and it did occur and it wasn't smoothed out to nothing. But in the interstitial space, the entire peakiness is lost. It's like you have taken the signal and put it through a low pass filter, basically. So the low frequency components maintain, but the high frequency stuff is lost. So this is also important to realize when we're making decisions about delivering insulin. And also keep in mind, a lot of what is done from the technology standpoint is to try to make the gray signal look more and more like the red and blue signal. So if you've been seeing in the popular press, oh yes, the lag time on my CGM has been reduced, it's not that the interstitial compartment has suddenly become faster at equilibrating glucose. It's that they have gotten smarter about doing the math to try to push it in that direction, okay? So if you ever see the latency on a sensor has been reduced, it's because they've played computational tricks to make it appear like the gray line is the red line or the blue line, okay? And then also important to realize that the way the special controls define iCGM and accuracy, there is no penalty for not producing data. The only thing the special controls say is that there cannot be any clinically significant gaps in the data. So in other words, you define that as you would like, but if the system sees a rate of change that is too fast, or it sees a blood sugar that is at 400 and staying there, they can say, oh, I don't trust this because usual diabetes behavior is not to have these situations occur. And I'm just going to throw a sensor error or whatever they want to call it. But basically, it's data blanking because they don't want to hurt their accuracy criteria, okay? So in this case, unfortunately, the regulators say we want to make sure that the reported data is accurate, but we don't enforce exactly how much of that needs to be reported. And the company says, well, we are seeing data we do not trust, and if we report it, it may adversely affect our accuracy metrics. So what do they give to the user? data blanking that occurs when a rate of change is too far in the negative direction. But for us that live with diabetes, this is a very uncomfortable place to be in, because maybe it is the case that the wire came out of the arm and they should be data blanking, but it could also be the case that, hey, I am falling precipitously and I really would have enjoyed having this data available. And I do see comments in the chat here. I will get to these as we go, but I did want to comment on Tina's, how was the IP measurement taken? This was in pigs. So in pigs, you can implant these sensors pretty what you might think of as superficially and still get the data. And that's because the intraperitoneal space in a lot of ways is faster than subcutaneous and other places. Let me get to some of the other questions here. So also remember that Dash has been mainstream in Android APS since late January. It probably already is seeing an open source effect. Oh, absolutely. So both Android APS and Loop integration into Dash has been spreading like wildfire, especially while people wait on the market release for Omnipod 5. So one of the things to keep in mind is there is always a narrative description that goes along with these events. So if the database were better at being searched, you might actually be able to search for APS or Loop. But right now, you kind of just have to read through those text descriptions, or like Jan did, download everything in mass and then use your own tools to analyze that data set. Joanne says, why aren't these companies held to a better standard? Our lives and therapies depend on it. It's a great question, Joanne. I think the reality is that unfortunately, what all of us probably are thinking right now is, well, if you have an iCGM or an ACE pump, the special controls, meaning those criteria that are associated with those things, should be governed by what makes a closed loop system work safely and effectively, and not the operating specs of the first device to be listed in that category. So I think this is where we have to do a lot of discussing and advocating with the people who are the powers that be in these sort of situations. And then, is it a coincidence that you can go almost 3 hours? It starts for 5 minutes and stops again. It's a good question, Priscilla. We see, unfortunately, what can sometimes happen is a sensor can refuse to start if you are, less than 40 or greater than 400 coming into a session. And the unfortunate part about that is, think about your brothers and sisters out there who are the more underserved diabetes community. What happens to a person who says, I'm finally able to access the CGM after living in greater than 400 range for decades? And they put the sensor on, and the first thing they see is they're greeted with sensor error. If you're already so hard up to manage the diabetes, your life is so difficult, and now the first thing you see is sensor error, how are you going to feel if you're coming in? And the whole reason you're wearing the sensor and putting it on is you're trying your best desperately to get yourself into a target range. You're going to feel like shit when that happens. So just keep in mind that the decisions that these signal processors make, they sit in a room with other engineers and think, this seat feels like the right decision, and they can be wrong. Okay, and I say that as an electrical engineer. Okay, all right. So let's talk about severe misclassification, because this is the one people often get up in arms about. So when might the system say you are over 400 when you're actually less than 40? So around most of these wire-based sensors is a glucose limiting membrane, which controls the flux of glucose to the wire. If this gets cracked for whatever reason, then glucose comes pouring into the wire and it will overread. So that's one potential way. And these are all sort of my hypotheses as to what might be causing these. But, it would be great if we could actually investigate this and actually understand why this happens. And now what about the situation where the sensor reads less than 40, but you're actually greater than 400 and the system has been suspending you for hours and hours? Well, that could be the wire came out of your body as you were low. So, the system didn't see this rapid downward rate of change to turn off the signal and say sensor error. Or, sometimes it gets wrapped in soft tissue like a tendon or a ligament, and then it may be starved of access to glucose. So it may not be in the interstitial space. And so then you might get an underread. Then there's another question. So obviously, I don't think there's anybody on this call who will say, oh, I love poking my fingers. If you are, come talk to me. I would be impressed. But most of us are going to say, okay, yeah, we love the fact that we don't have calluses on our fingers anymore. We don't have the tattoos from the multiple dots. But basically, it did eliminate this nice every 12-hour safety check that a lot of us had. So in other words, if one of these two events happened up above with a G5, you would figure it out eventually, and you'd probably figure it out when you had to calibrate if you were actually poking your finger to calibrate. So in that sense, we have traded quality of life and convenience for a little bit of safety. Now, would I ever go back to finger sticks? Probably not, but that's also because I have sort of verified at some point in the past that these sensors that were built for adult white males who look like me probably work pretty well for me as well, okay? So that's the reality, is if it works well for you, it's likely to continue to work well for you unless one of these, really infrequent events I listed at the top happens. But for those who do calibrate, it's a double-edged sword, because you also don't want to introduce undue bias on the signal, and you also want to make sure that you have you have the calibrations put in when the signal is not rapidly increasing or decreasing. So if you're going to calibrate it, do it at the right time, and do it because you are one of the people in the tail of that curve who got sacrificed so that the majority could have the higher accuracy. Okay. All right, and then so that's it for my CGM spiel. So now we'll get into the infusion set side of things. So I don't know how many of you have had this happen. You clearly see that insulin is not going where you think it should be going. Maybe some of it is, and maybe a part of it is leaking out. But an underlying assumption of almost every system, commercial or open source, is that what we deliver from the infusion set indeed makes it into the body. But we know that the infusion set is the Achilles heel of many of these systems. And certainly, if the insulin isn't going in, the system may adapt to that in an erroneous way. It may say, oh dear, this insulin isn't doing what I thought it should be doing, and it might up titrate to try to overcome the 20% that is making it into the body. And that's well and good for this set that is leaking. But then when you put the next set on, maybe that makes it too aggressive. So it's always this balancing act between how much do you want to really push and how much do you want to say, well, let's give it a moment, or maybe even suggest to the user, hey, you might be having a site failure right now, and rather than me play around with the insulin, why don't you just change your set out? And again, it's always a compromise between how much do I want to annoy the user with alerts that could be false positives versus how much do I want to just try to cope with it. And certainly there are cases where people form subcutaneous blebs that then they infuse enough insulin and they pop, but those can also be troublesome because then you get a large insulin release very quickly. So there's a lot of unfortunate things that can happen with infusion sets and really the body's reaction to the infusion set and the insulin, which is the constant battle. So the good news is that we finally have some extended wear infusion sets out from Medtronic, which do show reduced hyperglycemic failures and are approved for 7 days of wear. And we think that these will make a real quality of life difference, particularly if we have reservoirs filled with, say, concentrated insulin, so you can actually go 7 days with the reservoir and the infusion set. And of course, nothing is labeled for this yet. So until then, keep in your 7-day set from Medtronic, and hopefully we get a few others coming out from Capillary and Convatec. Okay, next, you know, when you're dealing with insulin models in a lot of systems, this has gotten so confusing. When all of us were learning about insulin, it would always feel like, oh yeah, everybody has a curve that looks like this. And, you know, Phil might have a curve like this. Eliza has a curve like this. Jackson has a curve like this. But actually, it turns out that these are very much population level averages for how insulin works. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the individual. And within an individual, there can also be variability in the absorption of insulin. So even the same person may not have the same insulin action profile. And then the other thing that makes this super confusing is that in some commercial systems, you can't even see the curve that they use, or they will set up a dynamic insulin model that can change, but the user is completely unaware of what that insulin curve looks like. Interestingly, Medtronic, for example, lets you set an active insulin time. And we know for almost everyone, the tail of insulin goes out at least 5-6 hours. Now, the linear portion of insulin, yes, you can say the old 3 to 4 hours that Medtronic used to stipulate. But now with the 780G, they've just gotten completely out of the ballpark, and they're not even using it as a term of physiology anymore. It's being used as a term that just allows me to bolus more or bolus less. And that's where things start to get really confusing, because we're no longer talking physiology, we're talking a arbitrary setting that Medtronic is unwilling to set themselves, but they will be willing to let you, the user or the provider, make that decision if you want to set it to a lower value so you can stack insulin. So it's getting more and more complicated to know, what do people actually mean when they say the speed of your insulin, and how do we model that? And here is the reality published from the group that would go on to become the bionic pancreas group. They actually continuously measured insulin levels and then had predicted insulin levels that their software was using. And as you see here, their initial model was a fast model of insulin. So it looks like, oh yes, we deliver the insulin, it goes up, and then it's gone. And if you look at this person's actual curve, it's much, much slower than that. So they actually realized that they had to make a different model that could cope with these differences in insulin speed and action. Okay, let me go back to the questions now because they're piling up a little bit here. So don't calibrate when high-low, even if you test to confirm actual status. So Thomas, the point here is don't calibrate when you're changing really fast. So in other words, if you have double arrows down or double arrows up, that's not the best time to calibrate. You can calibrate if you are within the 40 to 400 range, but I would try to do it when you have a flat arrow if possible. And I would also say you probably want to give it at least 24 hours because the first 24 hours have a much worse accuracy than later hours for at least Dexcom and Abbott. And seems like a leaky pod could create a multiple day issue for OP5 since it's based upon TDD. Absolutely, Carol. Is there enough data about skin damage from long-lasting infusion sets? No, we do not. Realistically, Joanne, this is incredible, and you guys probably won't believe this, but the first infusion sets were just, some engineer who decided, I need a way to get the product of my pump into a body, so let me design something. And there were certain mandatory things that the FDA made you do. You had to make sure, what you're putting in on one side of the infusion set is what's coming out on the other. You have to make sure that it is biocompatible. But the science of infusion set and the body's inflammatory reaction to infusion set, that's something that has only just in the last couple of years been started to be looked at. And Capillary has done a lot of good work in this field, sort of analyzing what is the tissue response to a 90-degree cannula, to an angled cannula, to a metal versus Teflon cannula. And these are unfortunately experiments that for a long time had to be done in animal models, but Earl Hirsch over at the University of Washington has actually started doing biopsies in people to look at this, and he has presented his findings now at ATTD and ADA, which is happening right now. So Joanne says, so don't calibrate in the first 24 hours. It's a tough one, Joanne. I know there are going to be situations where people may really feel the need to in the first 24. Oftentimes, at least the first 12, I might be a little more relaxed about it. And so I think it's a little bit challenging because we know accuracy is going to be worse then. And the question really is, we kind of have to do trials to understand this, right? The only way we know whether accuracy is improved or not is if under controlled conditions, we test it and then compare to a gold standard. And in the real, FDA world, that gold standard has to be a YSI glucose machine, that measures from venous glucose. At home, you might do this with a glucometer because, hey, that's the best standard that we have otherwise. Okay. And then John asks, how does a very low carb diet impact TDD? So TDD will be lower on a low carb diet, basal, bolus, and sensitivity based on units per kg. So in terms of it, John, one of the major questions we have here is insulin is insulin, right? When we talk, there's sort of this artificial division made between basal insulin delivery and bolus insulin delivery. The reality is, let's take an Omnipod, for example, because this is the easiest to think about. Omnipod is a device that delivers 0.05 units with some degree of inaccuracy, but it does it with different frequencies. So a bolus is multiple hits of 0.05 units in rapid succession. A basal is hits of 0.05 units in succession. So it's hard. So I say all this because I want you to understand that the meaningfulness of basal and bolus is really hard to separate when we start to get into automated insulin dosing. And I'll give you the example of the low carb. Now, what happens when you eat a low carb diet, but you maintain your calories? Well, usually that means you get the nutrition from other macronutrients like proteins or fats. Some amino acids that make up proteins are what we call glucogenic amino acids, meaning they get converted into the liver into glucose, but it's slow and it happens at a slow clip. So the question is your automation using basal modulation to handle that? Is it using super micro boluses? Is it using auto boluses? And how do you classify those? Are those just classified under an umbrella term of automated insulin dosing? If it turns out that they use basal modulation, are you going to call it basal modulation? Whereas if you switched it into auto boluses, are you going to say, oh no, this was a bolus? So those terms become artificial constructs when it comes to automated insulin dosing. But effectively, you need a slower release of some degree of insulin to cope with proteins and fats. And then Joanne says, if you don't calibrate, then Loop will be delivering based on wrong info. And this happens all the time, right? We live in a world of estimates and bad information, right? This is the milieu in which we find ourselves. The question is, how bad is bad? Where on that Clark error grid does it fit? And is it significant enough to do damage? And for the most part, if your CGM is under reading, which it does for the majority of people, you are in a reasonable place with most decisions. If it's overreading, that's when the danger can happen. And so let's go on now to talk about insulin sensitivity, because obviously this is something we deal with pretty frequently in life. You wake up first thing in the morning, you're stressed, your cortisol levels are going. Deadlines, you got to get the kids to school, you have a million things on your plate, so you're more resistant to the effects of insulin. But then as the day progresses, you get off work, your stress levels start to drop, you decide to go on a hike, and suddenly you're very sensitive to insulin. So even within the same person, insulin sensitivity varies through the course of the day. And within the pathophysiology of diabetes, insulin sensitivity varies tremendously. And especially during the period of we've had COVID drastically makes people more resistant to insulin. And I've seen higher doses of insulin delivered during the pandemic than at any other time in my career. So what can change your ISF? Well, there's a million things, but counter-regulatory hormones can do it: cortisol, epinephrine, growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen, glucagon. Age and puberty can do it because you have more sex steroids, you have more growth hormone, you have more stress. Body composition can affect it. So the same insulin goes less far as your weight goes up. Blood sugar can have an effect. So a lot of people postulate that you're more sensitive when you're low and you're more resistant when you're high. Illness and stress, as our COVID example illustrates. Medications, so lot of medications, for example, steroids can also cause lots of insulin resistance. And exercise, of course, your glucose utilization changes. Okay. And on the topic of exercise, well, you'd think, okay, well, fair enough. I'll just use the 30% preset for everything. It'll be fine. We're all good, right? But the problem is, it ain't that simple. Aerobic exercise, you might expect a drop in glucose levels, but if you're doing high intensity interval training with the same arm movements, you might actually expect a spike in glucose level. And my friends Desi Zariba and Mike Riddell oftentimes discuss this, that if you're doing high intensity interval training in the morning, you might actually need insulin to help counter it. And mixtures of these activities, which are quite common at a gym, for example, can have activity all over the place. So you're really in a changing space. Activity doesn't change the blood sugar target. It changes your glucose utilization and sensitivity. So this is why I suggest systems that actually let you change all of your settings uniformly rather than just changing a target. Okay, so now we've dealt with the pump, the insulin, the CGM. How about the algorithm? So a lot of it comes down to the rate of adaptation. You have to understand that the system must be able to adapt to actual changes in insulin needs, but not always these perceived changes in insulin needs that might occur if your infusion set is failing. So how do you separate the two? That's a challenging problem. Will a quick rate of change on your blood sugar? So one of the only downsides to rapid adaptation is, I'll give you an example with Loop. If for example, you actually had a rapid rate of change that gets added in with glucose momentum to the next point, and even if it's just sensor noise, that might actually have an impact on your next prediction. And of course, it will fix itself if the following glucose comes in, but with that rapid change, remember what I said about the sensors, they might stop reporting. They might just say sensor error, and then suddenly you're left in a state where your last data point was erroneous, that fed bad information into the system, and it's not going to get an accurate data point for another hour, maybe even 2 hours. So another big thing is, how does the system respond to that missing data? How does it respond to missed or late meal bolus? And how do we respond to announced or unannounced rescue carbs when we're low? Okay. Mike asks, is it just a postulate that resistance increases, ISF decreases with increasing blood glucose levels? Seems to be a fact in the community. I think this is one of those sort of we all seem to see this, Mike. But I'll tell you that the methodology used in trying to understand this has been really all over the place. And unfortunately, I haven't found an individual using great methodology. A lot of people use overnight responses to boluses, for example, but that can get really convoluted by the fact that some people, they may have just had a meal before they went to bed. So you have to control for a hell of a lot of things. But if you control for everything, you also make it hard to detect changes in ISF. So I think this is seemingly should be an easy experiment to do, perhaps with IV insulin rather than subcutaneous insulin. But it hasn't, it's been, you will see many papers published on this, but with varying degrees of findings and really significant variability in what they find. Okay. And then on the perspective of goals, which I always like to touch on, a lot of people want to push these systems as tight as humanly possible because, you may be type A, you might be wanting to set the high score in the video game. But remember, Our real goal with all of this is to live our life without complications so that we can do the things we love, the things we actually want to do instead of managing our diabetes, okay? Don't live merely to alter a number that is imperfectly reported to begin with, okay? The best controlled participant in DCCT was in the mid 70% time in range. The average time in range for people who did not develop retinopathy or microalbuminuria was 44 plus or minus 15%. So then you might ask the question, well, why do we say 70% then? Well, it's just because the people who did develop complications and didn't, there was a little bit of overlap in the Venn diagram. And so we figure going a little bit higher than that will probably be protected. And there are concerns regarding tight control. You can have weight gain, you can have associated cardiovascular risk, retinal disease progression, particularly in those with untreated retinopathy who suddenly get in very tight control. So what can we do in the here and now? First of all, I would say, as much as possible, advocate with manufacturers to not hide how your disease is managed from you. Advocate for them not to hide how they make decisions that affect your life. Advocate that the FDA keeps the data open for you to view and keeps you apprised of how they make decisions and involves the community in some of these decisions. You want to understand how factory calibration applies to you. If you absolutely need to calibrate, especially if your sensor is reading higher, try to do it when the glucose is stable. Also, I know a lot of us on the line have had diabetes that have exceeded the advent of CGM, right? So we were living with this disease before CGMs were a thing. So don't ignore hypo and hyper symptoms, especially if you get them. And if they conflict with the sensor, do trust your body and check, okay? Outside of meals, if your blood glucose isn't dropping after 2 appropriate correction boluses, examine and change your infusion set or patch pump, and account for changes in ISF if your system allows it. So now, what are we working on to help make this a little bit easier? We do not know how commercial algorithms work and what are the major modifiable determinants of aggressiveness. So we advocate, and we advocated in our open source AID paper, that commercial organizations change their policies when it comes to healthcare related algorithms. They are not using technology that is so new or novel that it's groundbreaking. They are using the same old techniques we have used in industrial processing for decades. They're just applying it to a new space. So that intellectual property should not come at the cost of our safety and our ability to understand the risks and benefits of the technology. Really innovate CGM technology. And I'm not talking about just make it smaller. Yes, that will potentially get more people using it, but I mean, truly figure out when these major issues are occurring that lead to these adverse events and fix it. Come up with ways that we sense no longer in the interstitial space, but perhaps non-invasively over blood vessels or minimally invasively in the dermal space. We just submitted a grant for a continuous glucose, ketone, and insulin sensor. We are working on new infusion set technology. We're working on implantable devices, closed loop intraperitoneal technology. We want to do short-term adaptation so that rapid changes are addressed, but we need to have safety checks in place. And we need to implement meal detection routines into all closed loop systems. OpenAPS has had it for years. the rest of the world needs to catch up. Okay, so with that, I want to thank the endocrine teams over at Stanford, my mentor, Dr. Bruce Buckingham, and the NIH for paying my salary. Here's some references and wanted to leave time for any questions. I will go back here. And do the risks of tight control sound awfully similar to the risks of loose control? Indeed they do. Indeed they do. That's exactly right. So Mike, you hit you hit it on the head. Unfortunately, you don't want to convert your type 1 diabetes into type 2 diabetes. That's basically it. By giving yourself extra insulin, particularly when it is delivered into fat, you raise your insulin levels up really high, generating a hyperinsulin state. And this is the same condition we see sometimes in type 2 diabetes, and we might imagine that there would be an association to similar complications. So there is a limit at which you can live your life for decades on out, and you don't have to work harder, you just have to keep it up, okay? There is thinking that keeping blood glucose time in range, A1C in normal range is predictive because non-T1Ds don't have these complications. Is this faulty logic? I think it is a little bit, Joanne. This is a great question. You know, your thought is almost always that if little is good, more is better, right? If we can get things to look like someone without diabetes, then we'll live 1,000,000 years. Well, the fact of the matter is we don't need to live 1,000,000 years, right? We only need to live long enough until the thing that would otherwise gets us, right? The only thing we are trying to avoid is we don't want diabetes to be the thing that gets us in the end. So for that reason, you only have to keep yourself safe. Even if you were diagnosed at 2 years old, you only have to keep yourself safe for 80, 90 years. You don't have to keep yourself going from a diabetes perspective for 200 years, right? Because something else will get you before the diabetes does. So just keep in mind that while you can, remember that the physiology of a person without diabetes is very different than the way we give insulin. And this is another one of my, I do my research in intraperitoneal technology. And so I'm a big believer that delivering insulin into fat is not really the best place for it, because that's not how people without diabetes do it. And the fact is that people without diabetes do not have to raise their insulin levels as high as we do when we inject into fat in order to get their blood sugars to same or lower levels than we do. How do we account for variability of absorption due to slow gastric emptying? An amazing question, Joanne. So I didn't touch on this, but this is another huge point, right? Everybody is variable. So, you know, as much as we would like to say, oh, every meal gets absorbed the same way, or even every meal gets absorbed one of 3 ways, like in Loop, the reality is people with different levels of gastric emptying have different absorption times. And unless we know about it, we really can't make an informed choice about how do we tell the system how our absorption is. So where should pumps be placed if not in fat? Joanne, so this is what we're sort of working on now. And this is the European experience. They've had decades of experience with this. Is they put the catheter near the intestines. And the reason for that is because everything within the peritoneal space gets drained into the portal venous system. That's the veins that are processed by the GI tract and go into your liver first. And that's where people without diabetes deliver insulin. It's not directly into the systemic bloodstream. It's not into the fat, it's into the liver's sort of dedicated blood circulation. And why is that important? Because one, the liver has a lot of insulin receptors that can use up part of that insulin. Two, the liver also can degrade insulin before it makes its way out to the systemic circulation. So in doing that, you keep the systemic levels of insulin much lower. Now that does require implanted technology, but the experience in Europe with this has been actually pretty amazing. Yes, and well, let me put it to you this way. I think there are multiple pathways forward. I think hopefully we have, the same biological solutions that they've been promising for us for decades. I hope we eventually, get there. But failing that, do we implant stem cells into the portal tract? Absolutely. That's what a lot of people suggest. Do we infuse insulin into there? Do we get a insulin selective for the portal circulation? Those would all be really great things that I think would improve our ability to exert control. But I do want to also preface this by saying I have plenty of 80 and 90-year-olds with type 1 diabetes at this point, okay? So don't feel like, you absolutely need all of this technology to live a long, satisfied life with type 1, right? Because most of those people did not have the technology that we have access to today. Another excellent question. Can you address bringing BGs into range too quickly? So this is something that I see a lot in my patients who have an A1C, over 14, who I put on closed loop therapy. So there are a lot of important compensatory actions that those individuals might take. So since a lot of the glucose that they eat is getting wasted in their urine, these individuals oftentimes are consuming thousands of calories a day in order to just stay on the cusp of body weight that they need to survive. And as a result of that, when you suddenly start giving them insulin, they put on weight in a hurry, and that behavior around eating has to catch up with this now ability to hang on to the food. So weight gain is an important one. The other is we have significant evidence over the years, particularly in pregnancy, that people who bring their control into tight range, who have untreated retinopathy, can have a sudden worsening. They may develop bleeds. They might even be vision threatening. So the crucial thing is, before you do all of this stuff, you really want to make sure their retinopathy, either way, is treated by someone. We now have anti-VEGF therapies to keep those blood vessel growth in check. And we have lasers if you really are far along in the disease to sort of prevent significant bleeds. So get that treated, and then you feel far more comfortable, both as the provider and the person with diabetes, bringing the blood sugars into range. The other thing is there's a lot of behavioral change for systems that don't have meal announcements. There is a significant change in behaviors surrounding diabetes management with respect to meals that has to happen. So a big part of this is the behavioral component as well, and prioritizing care of oneself, which is often lacking because a lot of people living in these dire straits, they don't have plans for the future. They're living in survival mode, moment to moment, sometimes with psychiatric illness, oftentimes with psychosocial comorbidities. So for those individuals, it takes a team. It takes a village to really help on all of the facets that are involved there. And if you bring technology into a person's life who is not able to feed themselves, house themselves, it might help, but I'm going to say that those other psychosocial problems must be addressed in order for the person to get the most use out of these technologies.
Okay, I can't even type anymore. I have so many questions. Given that, and some of us are in the DIY community, people come in and say, I want to start. What do I need to do right away? Should we responsibly say, slow down, meet with your healthcare professionals, get your eyes checked, get your endocrinologist on board before? We see some people saying, I want to have this all up and running before the first endo appointment. Should we make that a very important point as we're trying to keep people safe?
I really think see, the thing is, this is why I like to help people in this startup process, because I think the reality is it's the technical aspect of starting somebody up on closed loop. That's its own separate field from the medical aspect of getting somebody started on these systems. And I do think that it is really a responsibility to make sure that, you know, the person has somebody to turn to for the medical half of this. So certainly, you know, a person who is telling you, you know, well, I just don't take my insulin, or, you know, my last A1C was 14%. I would start with understanding what are the barriers that are there for that individual, and try to understand, first of all, just as a person living with diabetes, are these barriers that are going to be solved with mere technology? Everybody should have access, undocumented, documented, you know, Black, brown people, everybody should be given the opportunity to have access. But we must do it in a responsible manner and make sure that in addition to treating them with technology, we are also making sure their general health is well covered, that they are being taken care of, that they have a minimal basic income to satisfy their daily needs, that they have a house, that they have the opportunity to live and work.
Yeah, and even with privileged people who aren't struggling, the importance of understanding food nutrition values, the need to maybe pre-bolus, and need to know that tomatoes actually do have carbs. It's not just a vegetable. There's an education process, and maybe we can point to that as well, because it's not just the individual, it's the whole family.
Absolutely. And here's the other thing I was also mentioning, you know, you don't want the type 1 diabetes also becoming type 2 diabetes. A lot of people have this idea or perception that they just counter whatever they eat with insulin, and that'll take care of everything. Well, if you gain 10% body weight, you've actually undone a reduction of A1C from 7 to 6%. So it is important to realize that we have the same constraints. I wouldn't tell anybody else out there to drink cups of orange juice, or, you know, be having sugary sodas or things like that. I wouldn't tell anyone diabetes or not to be doing those things. So I'm not going to tell the person living with type 1 to do those things either.
It's a tricky juggling act. As I've been listening to you, I kind of threw up my arms at one point and say, how are we supposed to do this? If the meters aren't accurate, we get infusion sets that don't work well, we get CGMs that are inaccurate, and then we've got algorithms that are based on inaccurate. What are we supposed to do? That
is the state in which we live. We live in a world of uncertainty. You know, Heisenberg will agree with us on this one. You cannot observe and measure the state simultaneously. So this is the unfortunate predicament that we live in. We live in a world of uncertainties, but the reality is on the broad strokes level, we are achieving levels of glycemic control that we would have never dreamt possible 20, 30 years ago. So all this being said, everybody is doing so much better as a population in general, that, you know, even though there is this uncertainty, we do know, and this is why I prefaced it at the very beginning, that for most people with type 1, AID will have some value and benefit, and the benefits outweigh the risks. But we must all acknowledge that it is a world of uncertainty and errors of approximation, and so we have to be aware that this is not a perfect system. It likely never will be. Measurements always come with inaccuracy. Again, we just have to get it to good enough. That's the key.
We have to get regulatory to be on our side and actually fight for that as well. But that's another evening, Rayhan.
That's a topic for another day. Mike asks, might more frequent CGM readings help mitigate sensor errors? That is every 2 minutes instead of every 5. Believe it or not, certain companies have actually patented checking every 5 minutes. The actual frequency of sensor measurements. So many will have to choose a different frequency. But all that being said, you know, it's a good question, Mike. But let's say it's the glucose limiting membrane that's cracked, for example. Doesn't really matter. You could keep checking. You're still going to see a bad reading every 2 minutes now instead of every 5 minutes. Some people have suggested that if there is just a noisy sensor, then what they might do is they might sample more frequently, but then only report out the smooth value every 5 minutes, for example. So for a noisy sensor, that might help, but that's probably not the situation where you're seeing a less than 40 when you're actually greater than 400.
Rayhan, thank you. I know you could keep talking. I know we could keep pitching you questions. This is real important in our community. This is essential because we're all moving in this direction and we launch into it. We want it. It looks really, really good, but there are cautions. And thank you for sharing. Thank you for all that you do for our community. Thank you for taking time. Everybody, thank you for joining us tonight. And the video will be edited and released. Not much to edit, it's all perfect. But anyway, thank you so much. Have a great evening, everybody.
All the best, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.